Greetings, listeners, and welcome to episode 221 of the Game Design Roundtable. I'm Dirk Niemeyer, joined by my co-host David Heron. This is the first episode in our series on designing thematic games. Over the next months, we will be interviewing outstanding designers who have done particularly interesting work designing for theme. To kick off the series, we are joined by Nikki Valens to talk about designing games based on themes that derive from original work by H.P. Lovecraft. An expert in this topic, her design credits include Eldritch Horror, Arkham Horror, and Mansions of Madness. Finally, before we get started, the Game Design Roundtable is building a community of game designers. We have forums on Reddit and Facebook, and also just launched a Discord server where we're going to be hanging out on a daily basis. To check out any of these, head over to our new website for the Game Design Roundtable, tgdrt.com, where you can find and access the community of your choice. Now, let's get started with Nikki.
One of my favorite games and my partner's favorite games is Eldritch Horror, which I think is probably what you're best known for. You want to just sort of give us some high level, talk a little bit about that, and maybe how it relates to the theme of this week, or the set of interviews, which is designing for a theme.
Sure. So Eldritch Horror is a cooperative adventure game where you're playing as some investigators who are just kind of going around the world dealing with, some cultists who are trying to summon eldritch gods for various reasons, and you're trying to put a stop to that, or solve a mystery as to what exactly they're up to and how you can undo their rituals and things like that. It's a pretty mechanical game, but it's also very thematic, and plays with the Arkham Horror universe, which is FFG's Fantasy Flight Games kind of version of the H.P. Lovecraft Cthulhu universe.
Yeah, and mentioning that, I mean, we're going to be talking about Eldritch Horror as well as other games you've designed, and you have done particularly a lot of work in this Cthulhu universe. So maybe explain to our listeners who might not be familiar, who is H.P. Lovecraft and what this Cthulhu universe is all about?
Sure. So the Cthulhu mythos is kind of this public domain set of a bunch of different short stories that are all about a cosmic horror setting. Basically, it's set on Earth. Most of them in the mid to late 20s and 30s of the 1900s, and it's a lot of existential dread and not knowing what else is in the universe, and various horrible monsters and things that exist without us knowing about them within our world. And all of this the core stories of it are written by H.P. Lovecraft, but then there are many other authors who knew and worked with Lovecraft or have worked with the same setting in the many years after. And all of those different stories have kind of become part of the same mythos, as it were.
And I think for people even who aren't familiar with it, I mean, just as you talk about it, there's obvious sort of rich veins thematically in what is going on there. Now, you mentioned with Eldritch Horror, to pivot back to that specific game, that it's a very mechanical game. And what are some mechanical decisions you made to enhance the experience of the Cthulhu theme, and why did it work well?
So a lot of what the mythos has is about the universe and other planets and the stars and the kind of unknown of what is going to happen, but also kind of relates to not necessarily prophecies, but like things that have been foretold that will eventually happen, like the return of different elder gods or things like that. So one mechanic in Eldritch Horror that I always felt helped embody that pretty well is called the Omen track. And what this is, for anyone that's not familiar with Eldritch Horror, there's essentially this circular track on the board that just rotates clockwise every now and then. And it determines what sections of the board you have to focus on in order to prevent the kind of end game from reaching you faster. But at the beginning of the game, it feels like this is a thing that's bad. Like the omen advancing feels like a bad thing because it can cause doom to occur. It can cause all these other bad effects to occur. But as you get used to the game and you understand the mechanics, you start to rely on the omen track as a way to predict what is going to happen, because you know that it's going to have this consistent cycle of moving clockwise on this track and know what each step of that track will trigger. You get to anticipate what's going to happen and kind of prepare for it.
David, you mentioned that you really enjoy Eldritch Horror. Talk about your experience of that mechanic as a player. And then, Nikki, I'm interested to hear, just from sort of a design process, how you got to the Omen track and that became, a core mechanic of the game.
I think what was said is bang on. Like, I think a lot of the mechanics of Eldritch Horror are inherited from Fantasy Flight's other Arkham games, or Eldritch Cthulhu games, and this was notable as one of the differences. And when you're first approaching Eldritch Horror, if you've played some of the other ones, one of the things that hits you is like the scope is different. So it's a shift from being in a town or building into like this chaotic Indiana Jones style flying across the whole world adventure. And so you're having to spin all these different plates, and inevitably what this rotational thing does is that, depending on the mission you're at, whether at each different part, it governs different rules. And so I think the couple times you play, it's so vast and potentially overwhelming that I think you sort of just go through the motions. But I think it's totally correct that you sort of zone in on that this is this thing that's predictable. And what that means is, in the same way as our listeners that are familiar with a game like Pandemic, where if you haven't seen the epidemic card in a while, that one's going to come up, and you've kept in your head like which one of these, how many of each city's card are in the deck, you can sort of position yourself on the map. In the same way, you look at this thing and you're like, all right, in 2 turns, this thing is going to swing around and a bunch of monsters are going to spawn. So we need to get our character that is able to deal with those monsters. They need to be in, northern Russia to deal with those things. So I think it was definitely a very successful mechanic.
And Nikki, to follow up, like how did you arrive at that as a designer? How did you come to that?
Yeah. So that actually came about because of a kind of late design change that we had. There was a long period of time where so one of the other major mechanics in the game is that these gates are opening and monsters come out of the gates, and you need to close the gates in order to, keep monsters from overwhelming the world and killing people. But for a long time, the win condition of the game was to close gates, which made, as a player, like a gate would open and we'd go, oh, cool, we can go close that gate and get a point. But that felt really weird because a gate would open and we'd be like, oh, yay, a gate opened.
Right.
Instead of, oh no, a horrible gate has opened and is spilling monsters into a city. So we needed to redesign what the win condition was, but we still wanted gates to be the thematic, like the thing that causes doom.
Right.
So what we changed is we tied each of the gates to a specific color of omen, and we created this omen track that is essentially just, as the token moves around the track, it's telling you which colors of gates are going to cause doom. So if the omen moves to the blue space, all of the blue gates cause 1 doom, which means that as players, you go, oh, we need to close these blue gates before the omen moves onto the blue space. So that's kind of what you get to predict then, is you know what needs to happen in order to stop doom from occurring. And you also know that if you don't manage to succeed in closing those gates, you see the repercussions before they even happen. You know, oh, if the omen's going to move to there, there's 2 blue gates, it's going to cause 2 doom to happen. Can we deal with that? Is that too much doom? Do we need to like focus on that immediately, or do we just need to like put up with that for now and deal with something else that's more of a crisis in the immediate future? And it lets you kind of plan ahead and figure out what you're doing. But the raw idea of where this circular omen track came from is it actually came from the cycles of the moon. I basically kind of had this weird flash of creativity moment where I was like, oh, the moon has cycles, and that can like help us, figure out how we want to deal with these gates based on like the different phases of the moon, which that was just kind of the original thought of it. But we, as we kind of delved into the theming of what's going on in the mythos itself, we decided to retheme that instead as omens. So that it's more of like, it's predicting these things that will happen to us in the future, as opposed to being cycles of the moon, which aren't particularly relevant to anything in the Cthulhu mythos. But the cyclical nature of it kind of stayed there, and that became the omen track.
I think one of the sort of the exciting things about the Fantasy Flight games is there's a bunch of content that ships with them, and then pretty regularly more content comes out in the form of expansions. And for Eldritch Horror, there were the first couple were like new characters, there were some spells, some new stories and things like that. But the ones that I think are the largest, they add additional boards and maps. And so, like I said before, you start with this like sprawling Indiana Jones style flying around the world, and then you buy an expansion, and it almost puts a magnifying glass, it shrinks it down and says, well, this time we have all that, but we're actually going to focus on the Arctic, or we're gonna focus on the pyramids. And I'm interested in knowing that when you're making those decisions to like zoom in on one part of that map, at some point you're like kind of changing. How did that intersection of this idea of like, now we have this map where we're zooming into it, how did that change the way you operated designing those expansions? Or did it?
I mean, not too much. Each of the sideboards kind of has its own scope in a sense. So like the Egypt sideboard, for instance, it's definitely much more zoomed in compared to the other 2 sideboards. But we didn't want, like, we can't let that break the scope of the rest of the game, because
right.
If it takes an entire action for me to move from London to the North Africa, but then I get into Egypt and a single move only moves me between like Cairo and the Great Pyramids.
Exactly.
Like,
yeah.
It's so much bigger that it doesn't make any sense anymore. So we kind of just had to design mechanics around that. So for instance, because the Egypt sideboard is so much zoomed in, moving between all those spaces is almost like a free action in most of the cases. You can kind of just, almost every space on the Egypt sideboard is kind of just like one space on the larger board in terms of how much effort it takes you to move between them. But then the other sideboards are a little different. Like the Antarctica sideboard, you can only really there's 2 different ways you can get into Antarctica from the main board. But like once you're there, there's kind of just one path that you can take into the center of Antarctica. And we intentionally wanted that to feel like a long, harrowing journey. So even though the scope isn't exactly correct, we made it so that it feels like it takes more effort to go through Antarctica than it does to just like get on a ship and cross the Atlantic, where as a character in that setting, you're just kind of like, I mean, I'm on the ship and I'm doing my thing, but I'm not the one swimming across the Atlantic or something. Whereas in Antarctica, it's much more like, oh yeah, you have to exert this time and this effort to like actually get there, because you don't have, an airplane or something that's just taking you wherever you want. And
were there mechanics that did that?
There are some. So like there's like some dog sleds that you can get
right
when you're there to help you around. Having the dog sleds is definitely, it saves a lot of time when you're in Antarctica. But if you didn't have that, it's just like, oh, I guess we're hiking on foot through just 4 feet of snow for days at a time.
Right.
Yeah. So, I mean, we kind of play with that scope in different ways and kind of get different feels out of what those things are, which kind of ties into the idea of how does theme and mechanics relate to each other.
Either for Eldritch Horror proper or for any of the expansions that you've had, what is something or some things you tried to do during the design process that didn't end up working well, and why didn't it?
I don't know. It's kind of a thematic thing. It's a little bit more mechanical side of it, but there's a component type called impairments, which are sort of an inverse to this component that comes in the base game, which is called improvements. So the idea of Eldritch, because it's at a much larger scope where every round of the game is like almost a week's worth of time in the storyline, your character can kind of improve themselves over time. Like they can, physically train, or they can, research things and learn new stuff. So these improvement tokens that came with the base game were essentially permanent additions to your stats. You can just permanently increase your stats. Impairments were the inverse of that. It was things that would go bad for you that could cause you a negative decrease of your stats. And functionally, mechanically, they do work as intended, like they do what they're supposed to be doing. But it is just something, it's a mechanic that's not fun for most players. The idea of like, oh, I've been punished with this like permanent debuff that prevents me from being able to accomplish the goals that I have as a player. So although those things are mechanically working as intended, it's kind of a failure in the design that it creates an unfun experience for the players, even though it is mechanically functional and thematically appropriate. It just doesn't feel good to play.
That makes sense. And David, you actually had a question that kind of relates to some of these same themes. This might be a good time for that.
Sure. So I think in the Cthulhu mythos, as when you described it, you talked about existential dread. And I think that we can see that in the tabletop role-playing games. We can see it in some other instances of whenever Cthulhu gets evoked, people use the word existential dread. People talk about failure, and it sort of seems that like in some cases, specifically maybe the tabletop role-playing game, or Delta Green, which is another version of it, that the culture sort of revels in the idea that their characters are going to die. If you're playing it right, we're going to get torn apart by the monsters. I was wondering if you felt that enthusiasm for failure was found in the tabletop board game community, or specifically for the Fantasy Flight games. And if not, like, how did you approach mechanically trying to harness that theme of existential dread and failure? If you want to speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the communities, the gaming communities that play Eldritch Horror and Arkham and Mansions, they definitely have that same sense of, we're going to lose spectacularly, but we're going to go out in a blaze of glory and it's going to be awesome. That kind of mentality is there. And it definitely comes from the source material. Like almost every single one of the Lovecraft stories and the related stories in the mythos are like something terrible happens and these people are trying to like figure out what's going on and they're just trying to survive. And in the end, like they all go insane or they die or something else happens. It's kind of this accepted part of this setting and this kind of theme of just like this is intended to be like we are mere specks in the universe, and ultimately our lives are inconsequential to the rest of the universe. So should we die or go insane, that's just part of the game. That's part of what this universe is like. And it's kind of just an accepted part of what these games are like. They are intended to be very challenging games. They evoke that same feeling that you'll probably lose them more times than you win them. But even your losses will be thematic and interesting. And when you do finally overcome those challenges and win them, that victory is even more satisfying.
Right. So how does your work? Can you think of an example of an opportunity, like the idea, like what you said about the blaze of glory rings really true, right? You have this, my character lights the dynamite and runs at the unspeakable horror, right? Where do your games, how do you capture that moment and how is that executed?
I mean, a lot of it is just how the players interact with the pieces that we give them, and we intentionally give them the ability to like do those things. So like in Eldritch Horror, for instance, when you're fighting a monster, you deal damage at the same time that the monster deals damage, which allows you to have those situations that you can like, I'm running at Cthulhu with a shotgun and I'm probably going to die, but I might take Cthulhu with me. Like you get to have those moments where you just roll the dice and see what happens. And if it works and you manage to defeat some horrible monster or the end boss, then everyone's excited and gets to cheer about it. And if it fails, then it's like, yeah, well, you ran at Cthulhu with a shotgun. That was the expected outcome. But absolutely the same thing that you talked about earlier, I light the dynamite and literally just run with the dynamite toward the monster instead of trying to throw the dynamite. Those types of situations come up in the games a lot. And oftentimes those are the most effective ways that you can actually deal with those challenges.
Right.
Let's pivot to talk about another Cthulhu game you've worked on, which is Arkham Horror. So Arkham Horror is a classic from now way back in 2005, and it's a cooperative adventure game. You joined the team for the third edition, amending the original design of Richard Launius and Kevin Wilson. So what opportunities or limitations did you have to enhance or otherwise evolve the thematic implementation in this work, given that it was building off an existing design from other people?
In terms of limitations, there weren't much. Just going into third edition, I was the designer for it, and I basically had free reign to do anything that I needed to do in order to make it what I thought would be a successful game. With just the core tenet of it's supposed to be Arkham Horror, so we're still shooting for that level of flavor and theming and just what you're getting out of that experience. So the idea of, all right, we're in Arkham and we're, stopping a cult from doing something and running around town and riding motorcycles and shooting shoggoths with shotguns. That's kind of the general vibe of that game. So we just kind of carried that forward into the third edition. But then in terms of how do we get more out of that narrative than second edition did, I pushed it in a direction to intentionally do that, to have a bit more of a kind of line of a narrative as opposed to the second edition, which is more of, oh, this thing is happening, and then you're just kind of playing the game and you don't really hear that much more about the narrative as the game goes on. I pushed toward a version of it that has kind of a multi-part story that you're working on one part of the story, and then you finish a certain piece, and you start telling the middle of the story, and then you work through that part, and then it starts to tell you the end of the story. And depending on how well you're doing, or if stuff is getting out of control for you, then the endings can be different in those scenarios as well. That, oh, we didn't do well enough, and the cult has managed to summon, Yog-Sothoth or something. Or,
Right.
oh, we did really well, and we've stopped the cult from performing this ritual, but we still need to do this one last thing that would totally prevent Yog-Sothoth from, managing to get to our world or something like that. So it focuses a little bit more on the narrative that's happening, as opposed to second edition, which is kind of mechanics first, but then lets the story evolve just
Right.
pieces as they fall.
Right. I think a lot of fans and a lot of sort of online comments would sort of talk about it as like a more streamlined version. And I think even that may have been talked about with Eldritch Horror. If Eldritch Horror, they took, there's this refinement. I can see some definite through lines. I can feel your design fingerprint on these things. And I'm interested when you take something like when you in Arkham Horror 3rd edition, I think it's fair to say that like the collection of items is de-emphasized, like the shopping, I'm going to load up and I'm going to have this huge stack of cards that my character has, and then I'm going to try to deal with the monsters once I'm all powered up. When you make this decision to put theme first and streamline for something more effective, what was your process in sort of weighing the trade-offs of like, I know this is going to make a better game, but there might be this expectation from the previous editions?
Whenever you add something to a game design, you kind of have to take something out. Like, I like to think of the complexity of a game as a resource that I have as a designer. I want the game to be a certain level of complexity because that gives it narrative depth and mechanical depth and strategy. But too much complexity makes it difficult to play the game. And not enough complexity means that there isn't enough depth that the players can feel that they really have the agency and the choices that they want. And the strategy that they want to get out of it, which means you're aiming for a very narrow band of complexity. So in order to add some components or some mechanics in one place, that increases complexity. And you have to, as a designer, figure out, where can I take complexity out of the design? Because I'm shooting for that narrow band. And if I want to add these mechanics or this narrative that helps the design or helps the experience in a specific way that I feel is important, there must be something that's less important that can be simplified or can be taken out entirely to essentially to hit that mark of complexity that you're shooting for. I mean, it does that a lot. Like the second edition definitely had more of a focus on gearing up and getting items. And part of that was it's a lot easier to, first of all, see how you do that as a player, and then also to execute on it as a player in second edition. Mm-hmm. It's more of just like, I have money, I go to the store, I buy stuff, which still exists in the third edition, of course. But it's kind of obfuscated behind the narrative a bit more. So instead of just being able to walk up and be like, yes, I will reveal some cards from the item deck and then I will purchase these cards. It's, I go to the store and I have an encounter at the store where I'm, talking to the clerk and, oh, there's a sale on some items and I get to look at these and purchase from a set number of them. The mechanic is very similar, but it has that added layer of there's narrative on top of it. But because that narrative is there, it makes it less obvious to the players of, oh, I can just go to the store and buy stuff, which is how the second edition handled it, where it's printed directly on the board. Like you can just literally go here and buy stuff. It's kind of weighing those same things like I was talking about. Like it adds that ability to, like, you can still do that. You can still just take money and go buy stuff at the store. You're just getting a little story along with it. But it removes the other piece of complexity of having two different ways that you could approach the store of, do I just walk in and have an encounter where I have no idea what's going to happen? Or do I instead choose to simply reveal some cards and buy some stuff, but don't get a story from it? I've essentially merged those two options into one. You get a story that is more going to consistently allow you to buy some items, but that's not necessarily perfectly clear to the players. They don't know what to expect until they kind of experience it a couple times.
Another important Cthulhu game you've worked on is the second edition of Mansions of Madness. Tell our listeners what Mansions of Madness is all about.
So Mansions of Madness is similar to the other two, but it's zoomed in even farther. So where Eldritch Horror is about the entire world and Arkham Horror is about the city of Arkham, Mansions of Madness is about solving some kind of a mystery or stopping something from happening, specifically in a smaller confined location, like a mansion or something of similar size, like a museum or a school. But a lot of the same theme is still there, and a lot of the same things are still happening. You're working as investigators to try to figure out what is happening. You're probably stopping some cultist or some monster from doing something. Maybe there's a gate involved and you close that. But because it's such a narrower scope, you're thinking about much smaller incidences than something like Arkham Horror or Eldritch. A single turn in Mansions of Madness is maybe a couple minutes, where a turn in Arkham might be an hour or two, and a turn in Eldritch is like a week.
And what were some of the more substantial changes you made from the first edition?
So one of the big things that first edition had that second edition doesn't is that it wasn't actually a cooperative game. It was a one versus many game, which is a specific type of board game. But it had that because it was based on the Call of Cthulhu RPG. And like other RPGs, it's a storytelling system. It's meant to have this narrative tale that all the players are telling together. So because the first edition was based on that, it kind of carried over that same idea of there is a single keeper who's kind of the GM and is managing, the mystery and controlling the movements of the monsters and things. But the conversion from RPG to board game changes the expectation about what that means to a lot of players. In an RPG, it's expected like, yeah, the GM isn't there to kill us. Like, we're trying to tell a story. But in a board game, in a one versus many setting, a lot of players read that as this player is trying to win the game. That player's goal is to kill all of the investigators and have the cult summon terrible monsters. But the game itself wasn't necessarily balanced around that. It kind of wanted that keeper player to play more like a GM would for an RPG. So there was a little bit of unbalance in how that game played out, which created some unfun experiences. So that's kind of the main focus of the second edition of Mansions of Madness is how do we take what we wanted that experience to be and make it a fully cooperative experience where all of the players get to be a part of the story. And it's not about like overcoming another player. It's about overcoming the horrors of the mythos.
It's interesting because I totally follow the context, the difference between Dungeons and Dragons and this game is the adversary relationship with that enemy, which if we think about the theme of the game, it's like, in Cthulhu, the players are specks. They don't matter. They're ants. Cthulhu would never pay them any mind. So what about the game allows you, or how can you work within this theme of existentialism and of the players not being useful, but then sort of capitalize on the confrontational or antagonistic, like one versus many relationship.
I mean, the whole goal of second edition is to not have that. But the focus then being on how do we deal with this existentialism, because Mansions of Madness is such a scaled down scope. We're usually not dealing with any of the elder gods or ancient ones like directly. Like Cthulhu doesn't really show up in a Mansions of Madness scenario, because that, like, Cthulhu doesn't fit in a mansion to begin with.
Right, you just stomp on it.
Yeah, we're more dealing with like a much smaller scope than that. So it's here is these like 5 cultists, and they're performing some ritual where they're going to sacrifice someone to like appease Yog-Sothoth or something like that. And you're like, well, I don't know about that Yog-Sothoth fellow, but I definitely do not want you to kill that person right now. So let's stop that. Why don't we?
The most conspicuously different thing from the first to the second edition of Mansions of Madness is the emphasis on using a software app to augment playing the game. Why did you elect to incorporate software into your version?
So the main reason is actually to accomplish that goal of making it fully cooperative. By having the app handle all of the roles that the Keeper had in the first edition, all of the players get to be on the same team. And the monsters and the mystery itself can still continue to play out in a challenging way, but without the need for one of the players controlling it, and without the need for a player to know what's coming, which means that there can be more suspense and unexpected things that can happen as the story plays out. The software also, like, it let us do a lot of things that helps keep the players in the moment and in the story itself. I've heard some people say that, like, they really like the ambiance that the app creates, because it can have sound effects and it can have ambient sounds and kind of suitable music that gets you in the mood for it. It kind of gets you in that same mindset of what you're playing. But the app can help maintain that level of being part of the game and being the characters in the game, by handling some of the fiddlier, more mechanical pieces of the design that having players do it would just be time consuming, or might pull them out of the experience, or just be kind of annoying, especially if something goes wrong and the like a player, does something that they're not supposed to with a card. Like, having that go wrong could be derailing to the scenario itself of how the story plays out. But having that all controlled by the app behind the scenes, so much more quickly than the players can, be moving cards around or shuffling things or trying to read some flowchart about what's supposed to happen next. It essentially allows the story to just play out for the players, and they can be part of it without having to worry about the turning gears and levers and stuff behind the curtain. And they get to just be part of the story and experience it.
Right. That's interesting. I've as someone who works with mobile apps, I don't think anyone has ever talked about the ambiance of one of my works. It's maybe something I wish I could capture one day. I'd like to pivot a little bit more about that ambiance and about the sort of the theme. And you mentioned, H.P. Lovecraft. Long time ago, a lot of the work has been based on it, and a lot of the work has been based on people, sort of contemporaries and other people around it. And I think one of the reasons why is because most of that work is now in the public domain. So we're unlike, Game of Thrones or Star Wars, which I think is another thing that Fantasy Flight works on, maybe.
Yep, Star Wars.
All right, totally.
Right.
Star Wars, right? That there must be some advantages. There's some big differences. I've only worked with big, like having to deal with CBS or having to deal with Disney, and that comes with a whole bunch of things that you have to jump through. So can you tell me a little bit about like what's it like working with a thing that means a lot to a lot of people, but there's no one really to answer to?
Sure. So I think the first thing to note is that FFG doesn't work with the Cthulhu mythos as it appears in the public domain. All of the Arkham horror games are actually part of what's called the Arkham Horror Universe, which is FFG's proprietary version of the Cthulhu mythos. So it takes that public domain stuff, all of that stuff that people love, and it kind of pulls it into a clone of itself. And then there's some things that get removed from it. There's some of the more recent stuff that is technically considered part of the like Cthulhu mythos that we don't consider part of the Arkham Horror Universe. But then there's a lot of pieces that are added to the Arkham Horror Universe specifically that aren't actually part of that public domain Cthulhu mythos. So things like what Arkham City looks like and all of the investigators that are playable within those games, those are locations and characters that are specific to FFG's proprietary version of that IP. But there is still a huge difference between working in that proprietary IP and working in something like Star Wars,
right,
which is a licensed IP where anything that gets created for Star Wars at FFG, all of that has to go through like a story group with Lucasfilm, and it has to be like approved, and there's like really strict guidelines about what characters can show up and what eras of Star Wars you can put things in and all that stuff. It's a lot more lenient to work with a proprietary IP because the story group that you're answering to is like 3 people that also work at FFG with you, of which I was one of them. So me trying to put something into one of my games was more like, hey, I want to do this thing. It matches up with our guidelines that I've been a part of creating. What do you guys think? And they're like, yeah, that sounds cool. There's a lot more freedom to create cool stuff within that setting than if you're working with something that you just don't really have control over.
So I think if we expand on that, like so much has been done by Fantasy Flight, but then also by like other people. Presumably, Fantasy Flight is going to keep expanding on their IP, and I don't know if you'll work on things in Cthulhu outside of Fantasy Flight, but where would you like to sort of like, how would you like to see the themes and the mythos change over time? What would you like to add? What are the opportunities that have been left untapped?
I mean, there's a lot of different opportunities. Like the stories are still being made, and they've been being made for decades. So like what the Arkham Horror Universe is focusing on is like that same era of the late 1920s and early 1930s. But like that's not true of all of the Cthulhu mythos. It goes into like the 60s and 70s and more modern stuff. I personally really like the focus that Arkham has on that era of the kind of Prohibition era America, because I think there's a lot of really interesting stories to tell there. I really like noir stories as well. So it kind of has that same feel to me. Like I really like the Arkham Horror Universe, whereas I don't particularly like the Cthulhu mythos in general. And it's mostly about that period of time and the culture that surrounded that period of time. But there are definitely some other things that I would love to see. If I was talking about like FFG stuff specifically, I would love to see like solo scenarios for Mansions of Madness. If you imagine like a single player scenario that's like, oh, we're going to focus on Jenny Barnes. Jenny Barnes is the only playable investigator for this scenario, but it's going to be a story that's like about her and her backstory. Like, I think those types of stories could be really cool, especially because those characters have been around for a while. They've been these are the same characters that were in the second edition of Arkham Horror in 2005. And these are characters that are beloved by the players and the fans of these games. So as a player, being able to be like, oh, this is my favorite character, and I get
of
worry
course.
about literally my favorite character. Like, that's such a great thing for the player to have.
Right, because the games that you make have to fit all these things. But if you want to make a game about, well, how does a librarian, or how does a spell casting waitress, or how does a theologian or an ex-cultist deal with these things, you could build an entire game around being an ex-cultist. Yeah. That is great.
Yeah, so I would really love to see that, either as just a scenario for mansions for different characters, or like a whole new game that's just much more personal to those investigators in some way. One of the ones that we actually kind of half jokingly talked about internally was, so there's an investigator named Wendy Adams, but Wendy Adams is a child. She is only 12 years old at the time of Arkham Horror being, like, whatever the events of Arkham Horror, like, she's still a child. But that means that, say there's the events of an Arkham Horror game where Wendy has been a part of this group of investigators who has closed gates and fought off monsters and stopped an occult ritual that would have summoned an elder god and ended the world. And Wendy Adams has survived this experience and then goes on to experience, like, to be a witness to, like, World War II. And we've had this idea of, like, okay, so years later, Wendy Adams, now as an adult, is like a paranormal investigator who has infiltrated Nazi Germany and is trying to stop the Nazi secret occult group from, like, summoning elder gods for to take over the world or whatever. It's like a different spin on it, but that's one of those ones that I always thought that storyline would be pretty funny and interesting.
Definitely.
A few minutes ago, you sort of nodded at the fact that H.P. Lovecraft is problematic, and we're drawing a distinction between Arkham Horror, the sort of FFG proprietary universe, and the sort of original Lovecraftian stuff. But, over the last few years, as we become more culturally sensitive to these things, a lot of people are grappling with Lovecraft's overt racism and misogyny. And you're someone who, really, reading your stuff has a high degree of awareness and public activism as well. As that sort of a person, how do you orient the biases of H.P. Lovecraft and some of the connotations of his work with your own beliefs and how it all comes together in your game design career?
I think it's definitely a challenge. I wasn't all that familiar with or interested in the Cthulhu mythos before working at FFG, and just kind of had to become an expert in the subject due to working on so many of the games. But Lovecraft's works are, in a lot of ways, just kind of inherently racist and sexist. And there's a handful of interesting ideas, and there's an interesting mood that gets created around that sense of existential dread. But ultimately, I think what other people have taken from Lovecraft's works and created from it are a lot more interesting and cooler than the original stories that Lovecraft told, just because of who he was and what his social beliefs were. So, I mean, FFG, obviously, in their Arkham universe, they're, wanting to make a crowbar separation between, like, those original stories and what FFG is trying to create now, because they don't want to be associated with that level of like bigotry. They want to have these inclusive characters in their games and show that anyone can be part of these games. So for the most part, FFG kind of just tries to ignore those aspects of the original stories and move forward with more modern sensibilities about being accepting and more sensitive to different people's lives.
Sure. And then moving away from Lovecraft specifically to more of a general sort of philosophical conversation, in your opinion, are there artists whose work shouldn't be available because of their beliefs outside of the work and or the content of the work itself? And related, are there works of art and design you think should be banned for their content? Where is or are the lines, and who should get to decide?
I wouldn't say that content or content creators should be banned per se. But I do feel that it's our responsibility as consumers to make our voices heard about what we like and what we care about and what we won't stand for. So, I mean, I wouldn't say that those works necessarily need to be banned, but I personally choose to not support things that promote beliefs that I don't believe in or that I think are wrong. And I know that that's fairly common for people to do, to just choose not to support things that they don't believe in. But in terms of should there be someone who gets to decide that a certain thing is banned, I don't think that's necessarily, I feel like that is almost crossing a line that we don't necessarily want to cross, because who has that authority and how are they an unbiased source? It can absolutely go in a different direction that we wouldn't want it to go, or potentially be corrupted and used in very harmful ways that doesn't help the cause of what you're originally trying to help.
Amen. Yeah.
Thanks so much for being our first guest in our new series format. We're going to have some growing pains, so we really appreciate you coming. Did you want to talk about any of your more your recent projects or things you're excited about, either in the Cthulhu mythos or maybe they have some other theme? Is there anything you want to talk about?
Sure. When is this airing?
It's airing on Tuesday. I think it's September 3rd. So it's about 2 weeks from today.
Okay. So then right about now, maybe like a couple days ago or very shortly, my new game, Quirky Circuits, should be in stores. So if you want this is a very different game from these are the ones that we've been talking about. Quirky Circuits is a cooperative action programming game. So you're working together with the other players to control a small, adorable robot who is just trying to do their daily tasks, like cleaning up dust from a house or making sushi to serve to customers. So if that sounds interesting to you, you should go out to your local game store and pick up Quirky Circuits. It's, I think, quite fun and very enjoyable, and people have been having a lot of great things to say about it. So you can go check that out.
Thanks so much for being on, Nikki. It's been a real pleasure.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me.
Thanks to Nikki Valens for being our guest. You can get in touch with Nikki on Twitter at Valens116. Listeners, we love to hear from you. Send along questions, critiques, suggestions, or anything you like. We respond to everyone. I'm Dirk Niemeyer, whom you can connect with on Twitter at dniemeyer. My co-host is David Heron. You can connect with him on Twitter at David V. Heron. And the show's producer is Sky Larson. He's on Twitter at RobTheSkyGames. Please check out our website, tgdrt.com, from which you can connect to our Discord server, subreddit, from which you can connect to our Discord server, subreddit, Facebook group, or to the podcast service where you'd most like to subscribe. Finally, if you'd like to do something nice for us, please take a moment to rate and review the show, as it helps more people learn and benefit from it, just like you. Thanks, and until next time, design well.